Of all the major Western third-party publishers, Ubisoft is probably the one people seem to like the most, and looking at their mostly consistent output of releases over the past few years, it's easy to understand why. That said, they have made mistakes, some of which have been bigger than others. And while we're all appreciative of the fact that Ubisoft is a company that tends to make sure it learns from its errors, every now and then we like looking back on those said errors, for the laughs, if nothing else. And in this feature, that is exactly what we're going to do, and we're going to begin with what is, probably in retrospect at least, their most hilarious blunder to date. E3 2011. All major publishers have at one point or another made fools of themselves at E3. Sony did it in 2005, Nintendo did it in 2008, and Konami did it in 2010. EA have done it more times than we care to count. Ubisoft's rock-bottom E3 moment came in 2011 with the infamous Mr. Caffeine. It was an uneventful and dull conference all around, but Mr. Caffeine's silly shenanigans turned it into an absolute train wreck. Visual downgrades. Most companies have been guilty of making their games look better in marketing materials than they actually look, but no company has done it as often and as blatantly as Ubisoft used to until not too long ago. Time and time again, they showed off games prior to release that looked absolutely stunning, and when these games came out, they looked nowhere near as good. From Rainbow Six Siege to The Division, Ubisoft became notorious in the early years of this decade for misrepresenting their games. Of course, there was one more notable example that did just that, which brings us to our next entry. Overhyping Watch Dogs. Back when Ubisoft first unveiled Watch Dogs at their E3 2012 conference, we were all taken back by how unbelievably excellent it looked. Stunning visuals, an unprecedented level of detail, an exciting premise, and what looked like unique and fresh mechanics that would leverage that premise in interesting ways. We all thought, this is next gen, and Ubisoft was all too happy to let us believe that. The game that we got a couple of years later was barely an imitation of that vertical slice that we had seen at E3. Watch Dogs looked nowhere near as good as what we had been promised. In many ways, it was a technical mess, but worst of all, at the end of the day, it was just an uninspired, boring, and by-the-numbers open-world experience, whereas Ubisoft had promised to deliver something that would be so much more. The Division's disappointing launch. The Division is another game that looked like the next big thing when Ubisoft first announced it. When it launched, it looked like it had taken multiple steps back during development on the road to release, but its visual downgrades were far from its biggest issue. Things such as a lack of engaging content and what was at the time a dull open world were the exact opposite of what an ongoing live service experience like The Division needed, and those issues did the game no favors. Thankfully, Ubisoft managed to turn things around for the looter shooter, and its post-launch content pipeline turned it into a much better game than what it had launched as, and for that, they deserve a lot of credit. Assassin's Creed Unity's launch. As the game to take Assassin's Creed into the next generation, a lot was riding on Unity. To say that it crashed and burned under those enormous expectations would not be an understatement. Beneath a mountain of technical issues, there was actually a good game in there, with a beautiful setting, some impressive tech behind those scenes, and likable characters, but the technical issues absolutely broke the game. It launched in a miserable state, to the extent that sales for the next game in the series were even affected, and Ubisoft were forced to pump the brakes and rethink their strategy for the franchise going forward. In the history books of terrible game launches, Assassin's Creed Unity's name shall forever be mentioned in the first chapter. Ubisoft Towers. Ubisoft Towers started out as an interesting idea, but as they often do, Ubisoft took it too far. With their overstructured and mechanical nature and the bloat and deluge of meaningless side activity map markers that they led to, the dreaded towers represented the worst tendencies of open-world games, and eventually they became a parody of themselves. Bloated games. For years now, more is better is a mantra that has defined almost every game that has come out of Ubisoft. And while we all appreciate games that give us bang for our buck, sometimes this can be a bit of an issue. For starters, this quantity often comes at the expense of quality. With absolutely massive maps that are filled with innumerable side activities and optional quests, the content in these games all starts blending into one another, to the point where it loses the handcrafted and memorable nature of content we so often look for in our games. Bloat has become a big issue in Ubisoft games in recent years, and we're hoping that future games will try and fix this issue. So many leaks. We're at a point where Ubisoft might as well not even make any official announcements for new Assassin's Creed games, because all of them invariably get leaked anyways. This has to be the most leaked franchise in the history of the games industry. Hell, even the new upcoming Vikings Assassin's Creed title, reportedly called Ragnarok, has been leaked. Microtransactions. Monetization is a sticky topic with most major third-party publishers, and while Ubisoft's infractions haven't been nearly as egregious as those of, say, EA or Activision, they've still been a reoccurring issue. In Assassin's Creed Odyssey, they came under the guise of time savers, which were technically optional, but many felt were more or less mandatory because of the grindy nature of the game, which pushed people into buying these boosters. More recently, Ghost Recon Breakpoint was an over-monetized mess, and nearly everything in the game could be bought with real money as well, to the point where it almost felt pay to win as much as a PvE game can be pay to win, especially with the game's, once again, grindy and bloated nature that pushed people towards these technically optional purchases. Oh, and speaking of Breakpoint, Ghost Recon Breakpoint. Let's end with Ubisoft's most recent blunder, which, to their credit, they seem intent on making sure to actually learn from, if recent reports are anything to go by. In addition to the aforementioned monetization, there was a lot else that Breakpoint got wrong. It was, of course, bloated, but its open world was also bland and uninteresting, while it also unnecessarily crammed in mechanics that were either half-baked, like the survival stuff, or felt shoehorned and needless, like the loot mechanics. The game also launched in a sorry state, with a number of technical issues and bugs and subpar visuals. Here's hoping this is a stumble Ghost Recon can actually recover from. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.